Okay, good morning everybody. Dear ladies and gentlemen, fellow applied linguists. I would first like to thank Eurosla and the organizers of this conference for inviting me and Charles Alderson to give this plenary address. This is in fact my first time at the Eurosla's conference and also my first presentation here. When I submitted a proposal for a paper a few months ago with a couple of colleagues, I was expecting to have a very regular, standard, low-key presentation and to consider myself lucky if there were more than 5 people in the audience. Well, I can see that there are slightly more than 5 people here, so perhaps I could consider myself lucky. So little did I know what was in store for me a few months ago. So when I got a message from Charles about a week ago in which he asked if we could prepare a joint presentation because he was unable to come, I first felt a bit intimidated. Those of you who know Charles know that he's a wonderfully clear and entertaining presenter, which obviously makes it very difficult to step into his shoes. Those of you who have heard Charles also know that he can sometimes be quite outspoken and critical of things that he doesn't approve of. To my relief, I found that this time he was going to be quite soft and was not going to present anything terribly controversial. More importantly, I found out that what Charles was planning to say was, for the most part, quite familiar to me because of the close cooperation with him over the years. There are a couple of areas that are less familiar to me. I'll mention them later. My career has been about language testing and assessment, and only very recently have I been involved in anything that could be called empirical SLA research. I thought that attending this Eurosla conference would be an interesting opportunity to see what an SLA conference looks like and to continue interaction with colleagues from other areas of applied linguistics. This interaction has become more intensive, especially over the last years when I joined a project run by Maisa Martin, and I also cooperated with other colleagues from my own university who specialize in SLA research. I have also become aware of the research carried out by the other members of the European SLATE network, mentioned just by Maisa Martin, and I'll be saying a few words about that network in a minute. A key message of the talk we are going to give is a call for more cooperation between language testing and second language acquisition researchers, and as fields of applied linguistics. I have personally found such cooperation interesting and rewarding in my own work in recent years. To my delight, cooperation between SLA and other fields of science was also encouraged by the first plenary speaker yesterday. I can also recognize a number of faces and names among the audience whom I've last seen in various language testing conferences. So I can see that there are individuals who were moved between the two fields, and obviously John Norris is a very good example of somebody who integrates language testing and SLA perspectives. The fact that Eurosla invited a language tester to give a plenary address on cooperation between language testing and SLA seems to reflect a more widespread acceptance that interaction between the two fields is desirable. Due to unforeseen circumstances, of course, you ended up with having not only one language tester here, but actually 2, although one of us is not able to be here in person. Whether that's a good or bad thing, you can judge later. Okay. We do not have empirical results to report yet. This talk is more about diagnosis or diagnostic assessment, which is an area that has been almost totally neglected by researchers and where cooperation between SLA and language testing is especially welcome. We discuss what, in our view, characterizes much of SLA and language testing research and how the two could contribute to each other. contribute to the understanding of the abilities that are needed in order to diagnose foreign and second language proficiency and learning. We will discuss how the construct we are interested in, namely the reading in a second and foreign language, might be defined, and go on to describe 3 studies that have just started and where we try to operationalize the constructs and give and gain insight into how the constructs might be better defined for our purposes. I start by saying a few words about what we mean by diagnosis of language abilities. We see diagnostic assessment as something that focuses on learners' strengths and weaknesses. It attempts to predict such strengths and weaknesses and possibly even explain them, although this last one is the most difficult of these to achieve. Let me add that clearer definitions of diagnostic testing or assessment are only emerging. Analysis of the meaning of diagnostic testing in language testing and educational testing more generally by Charles and by myself indicate that terminology here is very messy and diagnostic assessment can mean different things to different people. Very few second or foreign language tests claim to be diagnostic, and even those that do turn out to be rather a varied lot. Drawing the line between diagnostic, formative, and placement testing in particular seems to be difficult. On the whole, diagnostic testing in second and foreign languages is quite underdeveloped and under-theorized. We need to be able to get a better and more detailed understanding of language abilities than is currently the case in order to do proper diagnosis. We need to define constructs better, and we need to be able to operationalize these constructs properly. Charles's review of the state of diagnostic testing in his 2005 book revealed that diagnosis is quite well developed in many areas of life, such as, for example, medicine, car mechanics, and interestingly, from our point of view, first language reading. It seems that diagnostic often focuses on the weaknesses and problems rather than strengths in somebody's performance or abilities. The purpose is often to try to understand why something is not well, to find out the reasons for problems so that something could perhaps be done to remedy the situation. An important aspect of diagnosis is the tests and other procedures that need to be developed in order to diagnose something. You need both an understanding, a definition of the construct, of the phenomenon you want to diagnose, and you need to be able to operationalize that understanding as tests or other such procedures. At the end of our talk, I will briefly report on a research project that aims at, among other things, to find out what we could perhaps learn from successful diagnosis carried out and developed in other areas. In that project, we are not cooperating with car mechanics, not even with medical doctors, but psychologists who specialize in learning to read in the first language and who have managed to develop procedures that can both diagnose dyslexia and offer successful interventions and that helps dyslexic children to learn to read. I move to talk about what characterizes language testing and, in our view, what is typical of SLA research, to see where the main differences between the two lie and where they might contribute to each other. Most research on language testing concerns large-scale, high-stakes proficiency tests. Often these tests focus on written language. Obviously, a lot of testing and assessment takes place at schools, in particular classrooms, but serious research on such low-stakes, often formative assessment is still relatively scarce, although it is certainly slowly becoming more common. Communicative approaches dominate large-scale, high-stakes language testing. Most such tests are interested in finding out how well learners can use a second or foreign language rather than what they know about the language. Emphasis on testing major skills areas rather than narrow aspects or components of skills. And this is obviously a very good thing, but we should be clear that of the fact that diagnostic testing may have to be, at least partly, very different from this mainstream approach to proficiency testing. Serious language testing of any type or purpose should be concerned about the quality of instruments used, that is, with the reliability and validity of the tests. There is some progress in understanding how different tasks have an effect on learners' performance. It is taken for granted in language testing that different tasks have given you a different picture of somebody's language proficiency. And the common recommendation for designers of proficiency tests is to use as many different tasks and task types as possible, and as is practical if one wants to get a comprehensive and generalizable idea of somebody's proficiency. Interestingly, and perhaps somewhat sadly from the point of view of the topic of this talk, it appears that the testing of reading comprehension is often not very innovative and doesn't take into account whatever is known about reading in a first or second language, according to Charles's analysis. When we compare language testing and SLA, one clear difference between the two appears to emerge. Large language testing is typically concerned with measuring what is stable in language proficiency, because it usually aims at generalizing the results of measurements into larger pool of contexts, behaviors, and so on. In contrast, a lot of SLA research appears to focus on variation in linguistic performance due to a host of different factors. Seen from language testing perspective at least, SLA typically involves detailed analysis of learners' written and spoken performance and the development of indices that relate to accuracy, complexity, and fluency of performance. As was the case in language testing, there seems to be fairly little SLA research into comprehension. Also, there seems to be less awareness of variability due to tasks than in language testing, and there is clearly less concern for the reliability and validity of the data gathering instruments used in SLA research. This last point is also shared by Norris and Ortega, who stated in the 2003 chapter in the Handbook of Second Language Acquisition that only a minority of SLA articles report on the reliability of the measures used in their studies. Charles has invented an interesting metaphor to describe how SLA and language testing approaches to learners' performance differ from each other. SLA is usually interested in the particular morphemes, speech acts, and so on, whereas language testing is interested in performance across a range of tasks, texts, and settings. They are also driven by different concerns and theoretical backgrounds. The detailed micro-level perspective on language and performance of SLA could be called a worm's eye view of where one can see the details of the grass, such as the shape of blades of grass, different shades of color, and other such details. Whereas a typical view of language abilities from proficiency testing, at least, is more like a space satellite's view, where you can only see the broad outline of the continent and oceans, but not any details. As we see it, diagnosis or diagnostic assessment of second and foreign language abilities is squarely at the intersection of SLA and language testing research, and it could even be seen as a kind of fusion of the two areas. Diagnosis needs a theory of development, and clearly this could be expected to come from SLA, although obviously we should not forget other sciences that study human beings. From language testing, diagnosis needs insights into how tasks affect performance and how valid and reliable measures can be designed. Diagnostic assessment needs to be concerned with the particular, as SLA often does, rather than with the overall performance, which is typical of language proficiency testing. And diagnosis has to be able to predict strengths and or weaknesses, but it need not really worry too much about the generalizability of the results. Clearly, diagnosing second and foreign language abilities is an area where development would benefit from cooperation between SLA and language testing. In fact, such development is probably impossible without such cooperation. I now move on to describe some existing cooperation between SLA and language testing researchers in Europe. Some such cooperation has been inspired by the emergence of the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages in 2001, which is probably familiar to all of you. The CEFR describes the skills, knowledge, and resources that people need to use and learn languages, second and foreign languages. The view of language of the framework is communicative and notional functional, and learners are seen as social agents. The best known part of the CEFR is obviously the 6-point scale of proficiency, or in fact dozens of such 6-point scales that describe different activities, skills, and contexts. The levels of proficiency described in the framework look like stages through which learners progress when they learn languages. But there is no real theory of development behind the development of these scales, as has been pointed out by both SLA and language testing researchers. Importantly, CEFR describes communication in any language, not in any specific language. The framework is intended to be as applicable to Italians learning German as to Danes learning Spanish. Although the framework is called European, it is probably applicable to any language used for communicative purposes anywhere in the world. At least many people outside Europe, such as the Japanese and Chinese, appear to believe that this is the case because they have found it useful to translate the framework into their own languages. Because the CEFR does not describe the use of and development of any particular language, it does not contain information about the specific lexical or grammatical elements that are needed in order to operate functionally at the different framework levels. Interest in language learning levels of proficiency and this CEFR brought together a group of SLA researchers and language testers in 2006 to a couple of seminars initiated by Jan Hulsteen, Rob Schoenen from University of Amsterdam and Charles Alderson from Lancaster University. They were joined by other researchers from about 10 different European countries. And this network, as you heard from Maisa, is called, or started calling themselves SLATE, Second Language Acquisition and Testing in Europe. And they are interested in exploring a number of questions where cooperation between the two fields would be beneficial. And you can see here a list of things or questions that are on our agenda. SLATE has got a website here, if you are interested in having a closer look. slate.eu.org. Now moving on to construct. As you can see from this quote from Bernard Spolsky, the development of language tests or any other measures that aim to provide us with information about language abilities and language learning requires that we have a clear idea of what the construct or constructs we are measuring are. Fortunately, we could hear John Norris' excellent plenary yesterday about constructs, so we don't need to discuss them at the general level here, but we can move on more directly to consider reading in a second and foreign language. But before we do that, I would like to draw your attention to a paper published in 1992, which is in your handout, by Charles with his colleague at Lancaster University, Caroline Clapham. The reference is in your handout, as I mentioned. They were involved in the IELTS revision project, which was intended to revise a major international language examination. And as part of that study, they approached a number of applied linguistics in different areas of the field to find out what view of language and language proficiency should be incorporated into the new test. In this article, they analyzed the views and advice given by different applied linguists. And to their disappointment, there was little agreement in the experts' opinions. And the only thing they apparently could agree was that there was no generally accepted dominant paradigm or theory about language and language proficiency that could be used as the basis of the test. This was in late 1980s. We wonder what the result of a similar survey would be if it were carried out today. Is there now any more agreement on what language and language proficiency is than there was over 20 years ago? Nevertheless, the authors of the article thought that language testing and other applied linguists could and should learn from one another, as this extract from their article shows. So, we now move on to consider how the construct of reading in a second or foreign language might be defined, and how it could be operationalized as different tests and other procedures. This is an area where Charles is the real expert, and I'm only slowly sort of getting myself into this. And so if you have any sort of difficult questions on this area, I'll have to pass them on to Charles. Curiously enough, I started my own career in language testing back in the 1980s as a member of a team that designed reading comprehension tests. In those days, we actually didn't really know how to do that. We certainly didn't rely on any theory of reading when we were designing the items. And I remember reading about a number of reading theories in those days, but soon gave that up because they seemed to be so complicated, so far removed from the realities of practical item writing, that I soon gave up that exercise and moved on to something else like testing of speaking and writing, which is far more concrete and clear in my view. But now these reading theories have come back to haunt me after more than 20 years, and because of these projects we are now involved, really need to get into these at a more detailed level. Research on reading is an enormous area, but most of the studies relate to reading in a first language rather than in a second or foreign language. There is little theory development that is specific to L2 reading. We have found William Grape's recent book, Reading in a Second Language, Moving from Theory to Practice, which is in your handout, an invaluable synthesis of current views of reading in first and second and foreign language. And of course, we rely on Charles's past work on this area. Grape summarizes reading as an activity that is rapid and effective. We coordinate rapid automatic word recognition, syntactic parsing, meaning formation, and linkages to prior knowledge resources. Reading is a comprehending process. The central purpose of reading is to understand the writer, what the writer was attempting to communicate. It is also an interactive process because reading requires that many individual processes work together at the same time. It is a strategic process. The reader must apply various strategies, such as anticipation of information and the monitoring of comprehension, to read successfully. It is a flexible process. So the strategic processes must be able to be flexibly applied to a text. And reading is also purposeful. The readers must adapt their process of reading to its purpose. And it is an evaluative process. We evaluate when we engage in strategic processes, for example, when we evaluate how well we are reading or whether a piece of information is important to understanding a text. We learn when we read because the constant process of evaluation makes reading a learning process. And finally, reading is a linguistic process. We must have some knowledge of a language to be able to read. An important aspect of reading are a range of highly automated low-level processes that are needed to be in place for reading to be fluent. Automatic processes are very difficult to control. They just happen when the conditions are right. For example, we cannot stop ourselves from recognizing a familiar word when we read it. I assume everybody here knows English, so you can't help but recognize what this word is. You cannot not recognize it. Whereas if you saw a word that is not known to you, you wouldn't be able to automatically recognize it. There are some people among the audience who have done this automatically, but most of you, this happens to be a word where you might use your inferencing powers, knowledge of other languages to get at the meaning. It's auto, it probably has to do with some vehicles, and this happens to be the Finnish word for bus. So what is reading? It is rapid and automatic, so in reading, rapid and automatic recognition of a large number of words is crucial. And this involves a number of levels and aspects ranging from orthographic, phonological, and morphological processing to semantic, syntactic, and contextual processes. Our memory system plays a key role in all language use, including reading. Here we focus on working memory, although obviously long-term memory, which stores all our experience, is important in language use. The function of the working memory is to deal with what an individual is experiencing in a particular moment. It contains both storage and processing functions. It can store information and also process that information. Working memory has a limited size and limited parallel processing capacity. It can only carry out a limited number of operations simultaneously. However, once operations have been automatized, they place less of a burden on the processing capabilities of the working memory. The system which manages our attention is called the executive control. The executive control is supported by two further systems that are called phonological loop and the visuospatial sketchpad. That's quite a mouthful. The phonological loop allows the replaying and recall of subvocalized sounds, while the visuospatial sketchpad does the same for images and spatial relations. So we might call them as our inner voice and our inner eye. When we read, we convert the visual information of the text into phonological information, and the processing involved in reading comprehension is thus phonological. So at the lower level of reading comprehension, working memory does a large number of functions, as you can see here. It supports phonological, orthographic, morphological processing, and stores activated words, combines them, carries out semantic and syntactic processing. And it's also interesting, it suppresses irrelevant information without really, without really us paying attention to that. And it also builds the semantic ideas units. Higher level reading processes take place to build models of the text as a whole and extract meaning at the supra-word and supra-clause level. And a key feature of these high-level processes is that attentional resources can be applied to them. So we can decide and choose in how much detail we want to read a text, unlike we can choose whether to recognize a particular word or not. There are three major components of higher level in the processing at a higher level of reading. First, there is a text model that deals with reader comprehension. There's a situational model it's about reader's interpretation, and there's a set of reading skills and resources which are under the command of the executive control, which sort of is placed at or locates or makes use of working memory. The function of the text level model of comprehension is the extraction of the meaning that the writer is attempting to convey, whereas the situational model is about how readers interpret. So it's a kind of a synthesis of the text model and readers' background knowledge, attitudes, purposes, and so on. Comprehension via the text model begins when we first start reading a text. The formation of the text model of comprehension involves semantic linkages between what we are reading and what we have previously read. The model is located in the working memory. The more semantic units are repeated, the stronger their activation, in inverted commas, in the working memory becomes. As we read through the text, these semantic units which are not repeated fade in activation, while those we are repeated form the main ideas of the text. When new information is read, it overlaps with the previous pre-existing semantic maps and is incorporated into it. When reading a text, readers bring their own past experiences and background knowledge to its interpretation. These interpretations go beyond what the writer was attempting to convey and are overlaid on the text model. This form of reading comprehension is called the situational model, and Grape states or defines 8 factors which affect this model, and they are listed on this slide. Of these 8 factors, reader purpose, is the most important in the formation of the situation model. For example, if we are reading a text to pick out a particular piece of information, our situational model would be very different to if we were reading a text to summarize it and critically evaluate it in the light of other literature. In the first case, background knowledge of how the structure of the type and genre of text being read may come into play to inform a scanning strategy. In the latter case, much more background knowledge would come into play to allow comparisons and contrasts between the text in question and those to which it is being compared. And there are a number of very detailed cognitive models about reading, at least a dozen of them. Charles asked me to mention the following important point at this stage of the presentation. We are not going to go into detail about these, so don't worry. The main point here is that all these models are based on empirical evidence, with the exception of the psycholinguistic guessing game, and interestingly, it is the latter one that's been most influential in English language teaching, for example. And all these models are based on L1 reading, except the psycholinguistic guessing game model. When we are interested in reading in a second or foreign language, one of the questions that has puzzled researchers, just as Charles, is whether reading in L2 is more of a language problem than a reading problem. And the evidence suggests that it is more, in fact, more of a language problem than a reading problem, and that there is a threshold of language proficiency that you have to reach before L1 reading can transfer to L2 according to empirical research carried out, for example, at Lancaster University. Other research, such as the longitudinal studies by Sparks and his colleagues, suggest that many L1 reading problems also transfer to L2 reading. Theories based on the first language reading generally ignore the language issue, as it is assumed that the children know at least the spoken language already, which is obviously not the case we can do in L2 reading. It is also likely that L2 reading problems vary according to different L1 backgrounds. Some of the problems may have to do with how close the relationship between the sounds and letters is in a given language. You can speak about deep and shallow orthographies. My own language, Finnish, has a very shallow orthography in the sense that it is very clear how its sounds and letters match. English is a good example of a much more complicated relationship between sounds and letters. I mentioned here that spelling competitions, which are so popular in the schools in English-speaking countries, are totally unknown in Finland because they would be pointless. Unless a child has dyslexia, they would be able to spell almost all Finnish words presented to them orally with 100% accuracy after the first couple of months of reading instruction. And obviously reading problems differ also between alphabetic and non-alphabetic languages such as Chinese, Japanese and Korean. On the basis of our own experience and surveys of the literature, we can thus conclude that very little is known about how second and foreign language reading develops, how to identify strengths and weaknesses in that skill area, and which abilities contribute most to the development of overall reading in second and foreign languages, or how teachers could best facilitate reading abilities. Which is why we are interested in researching the topic, and we managed to get funding for 3 interrelated projects which are funded by a number of bodies listed here. We have what we call them the PISA project, the Pearson project, and the Diagnosing project. Charles is the principal investigator in all of these. All of these studies started at the beginning of this year. The PISA and Pearson studies are for 2 years. The Diagnosing study is a 4-year study. And we aim at getting a better idea of reading in the second and foreign language constructs, what the constructs are, and also we try to operationalize them and learn more about how to operationalize them. So it's kind of an iterative process. You can read the main research questions on the Pearson study in your handout. What characterizes both of these studies is an attempt to gain insights into reading constructs by analyzing reading test items and texts from different perspectives, with analysis, judge, expert assessment, and so on. In the first part of our talk, in the final part of our talk, I'll describe the biggest of the three projects, which is the Diagnosing project carried out in Finland. Charles is the principal investigator. I am its academic coordinator, whatever that title means. And there are also two full-time researchers in this 4-year project, one of which, Riikka Ullakonoja, is also here among the audience. The Diagnosing project is interested in these three broad area questions. Can diagnostic measures of L1 reading and writing predict difficulties in second and foreign language reading and writing? How does the proficiency in reading and writing develop in psycholinguistic and linguistic terms? And also which features and combination of features characterize different framework levels? And we do cooperation with Maisa Martin's new toppling project here. A main area of cooperation, however, is between us language testers, applied linguistics, and L1 psychologists who have done successful work in diagnosing dyslexia, also in Finnish and English, and develop procedures to treating dyslexia. The website is here if you are interested for more information. Our informants are Finnish-speaking learners of English and Russian-speaking learners of Finnish. And we have 2 or 3 age groups, depending on which language we are talking about. And we have a major cross-sectional study with 5 groups of about 200 learners, hopefully. We are just in the process of starting our data collection. And then, of course, 2 obviously smaller scale longitudinal studies or different approaches to research. The study 1 is the cross-sectional study where we explore the diagnostic value of range of cognitive and psycholinguistic measures, for example, and we try to learn more about for the benefit of the other 2 studies. The second of which is a kind of a teaching experiment with the help of 2 tools developed to treat dyslexia in Finnish and English. And the English one is called Graphogame. You have the URL in your handout, so I recommend that you visit that website and read more about it. And the third study is more like kind of a 2 or 3 year longitudinal study. We have a range of psycholinguistic measures that we have selected on the basis of advice of our colleagues at the psychology department. These are things that are known to predict learner, among other things, problems in reading in the first language, and we also use, of course, the literature surveys of reading theories to come up with these, and of course with the practical constraints so that we can't obviously subject our learners to several hours of testing. We have to draw the line somewhere. You can see that there are things that have to do with working memory, phonological processing, and things that came up when I was describing the views of reading from reading theories. I'll show you some examples. One of these is you have to read as many words as possible in 1 minute. These are words in Finnish, the mother tongue of the one half of our students. So you have actually more words than you can read in a minute, but the idea is to start from the short ones and read within a minute as many of these as you can. The other task is rapid automatic naming. An example with letters, you have to simply, the task for you is to say OASTPAOSPT as fast as you can, and then go on with the other one. And there's a more complex version of this, which combines letters, colors, and numbers. So you have to say green, 5, A, B, yellow, and so on, as fast as you can. Third example is the reading rapidly presented words. This doesn't replicate fully here, but I'll try my best. You probably saw quick flash of word, and in reality it's even quicker. And your idea is to say what was the word that you saw there. There's another task which is based on phoneme deletion. The learner hears in his or her earphones the word cars, or the, well, whatever that is, and he or she has to repeat it to say cars. Then it's the second part of it is, now repeat cars, but don't say sh, and you have to say car. And that's one of the phonological processing tasks used. And there's a backward digit span memory test. It's simply, you hear 2, 5, and you have to say 5, 2. You hear 5, 7, 4, and you have to say 4, 7, 5, and you go on as long as you can. And you can imagine that the last one is pretty challenging. So we have a number of linguistic measures. We haven't really, we won't be able to administer all the vocabulary tasks mentioned here, but certainly we will be testing both L2 and first language vocabulary. We have reading tests in L1 and in the second foreign language, and we have writing tasks. And when it comes to the second and foreign language writing and reading tasks, it's important to note that we'll be able to link the results of those tests to the Common European Framework levels. We have a set of motivation and background variables, a fairly detailed motivation questionnaire. We'll be asking a number of background questions from the learners based partly on the PISA questionnaire. We'll ask them to self-assess their proficiency in the second and foreign language, and we may be able to do some think-alouds and interviews as part of even study 1. We'll see. So one of the main points of this talk has been a call for more cooperation with second language acquisition and language testing researchers. And in that spirit, we would like to end with the question, how can SLA and Eurosla help language testers who are involved in studies such as those we just described? And we welcome all your comments and advice now and later via email. And we really look forward to cooperating with you in any way and form. Thank you.
Thank you, Ari and Charles, also for this really stimulating conversation, and also for focusing on this rather neglected aspect of SLA, that is the receptive side of learning a second language. So reading is really an under-researched construct in second language acquisition research. So really, this opens up completely new vistas for future research. So I expect many questions from the audience on this new perspective. So anybody willing to ask a question? There's a microphone there. Yes.
Thank you, Ari. Very interesting. Just a quick question here, and that is related to Grabi's model that you showed earlier on, and these sort of reader-side higher-order processes like reader purpose, and then dealing with genre and task awareness and expectations and things like that. And I'm wondering whether those fit into the research that you're engaging in now as something that needs diagnosing. Is that clear?
Yeah, thanks. That's a good point. I think we could try and, well, for example, perhaps with certain questions in the background questionnaire or analysis of the context to be able to address that, I think. But if you have specific ideas about that, we would very much like to hear about them.
Thank you, Ari. Very interesting talk. I have a question about the sort of intervention side of things. It seems to me that diagnosis is at the interface between, giving information and providing teaching intervention. I'm wondering about the purpose of these instruments and the usability of them. And you talked about diagnostic value, and I think the value of them has to partly reside in their usefulness for the people who are going to be delivering the intervention. So I wondered if you could comment on that.
In the research proposal we submitted to the Academy of Sciences in Finland for the dialogue part of the study, we were careful not to promise that at the end of this project we will have a set of readily usable instruments for diagnosing, because we feel that the area is so advanced not really advanced in such a way that we could do such a breakthrough in just a few years. We hope to be able to understand the constructs under investigation better, so that we start building ideas for concrete measures. That's obviously the kind of a long-term goal. And as I mentioned, our colleagues in the first language reading research, the psychologists, they have managed already to develop learning games that incorporate diagnosis of first language reading dyslexia and practices that actually can make dyslexic children learn better and more effectively than would be otherwise the case. So we know that it works there, and this interesting thing is to see whether some of those instruments, the learning games we are going to use in study 2, which is a kind of a interventions type of study, whether those tools developed for first language reading problems, what can they be of any help in treating second or foreign language reading and writing problems? We'll see. We're hopeful there.
I had a question myself. It's always difficult to strike the balance between the worm's eye view and the satellite's eye view. For example, for dialogue, so you said that now you are at the development stage, so you're testing different measures, different tests and different measures, etc. Is your aim to arrive at a more reduced version of the test that could be practically implemented in schools? So how do you strike? I know this is the standard problem in language testing, that is, finding a test that is valid and reliable and manageable at the same time. And what indication would you give to people working in SLA research that, of course, we have more time? I mean, we can spend 20 hours, 20 days for analyzing one learner, which is certainly not feasible for language testing. But at the same time, we all need to strike a balance between validity on the one hand and feasibility on the other. Do you think there is any advice that can come from language testing on this issue?
Well, it's impossible to answer that briefly, but I think what you said, it's important to strike a balance there, because obviously, as we know, even if we can manage to diagnose somebody a certain number of problems in somebody's performance, it's the question of how much time a teacher can actually spend in a classroom with one particular learner. Here, Charles has suggested, and in the future, because of this dilemma of diagnostic procedures producing so much information that nobody has time to deal with that, is to apply computerized learning programs. So when I'm thinking of the programs that the psychologists have developed, they actually incorporate, I think, they have a set of tasks that you do over a long period of time, weeks, months, and so on. So it's not a question of you do it during 1 or 2 hours and then you are fixed. You have to do it over a certain period of time. They have tried to do such an entertaining and engaging environment program that it sort of appeals to young children, and apparently they have managed to do that. But within those games, there are built into them a number of key measures that they have found can diagnose first language dyslexia. So perhaps that's the kind of a way that I can see for us, that there will be different types of learning programs that can both diagnose and then offer exercises and hopefully lead towards, well, more effective reading and writing in a second foreign language. That's kind of at the general level.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. I was attracted or surprised and intrigued by the comment that L2 reading theories have not been very innovative, or that they have relied a lot on L1 reading theories. And